The frozen Delaware River stretched before them like a sheet of black glass, treacherous and unforgiving in the bitter cold of December 26, 1776. General George Washington stood on the Pennsylvania shore, his weathered face etched with the weight of a dying revolution. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled around flickering campfires, their breath visible in ghostly plumes against the winter night. These were not the proud patriots who had marched from Boston months earlier. These were the remnants of a shattered dream. The Continental Army was hemorrhaging men faster than British musket balls could claim them. Enlistments would expire in 5 days, and most soldiers planned to abandon the cause and return to their families. The recent defeats at Fort Washington and Fort Lee had left Washington's forces demoralized and scattered. British General William Howe controlled New York, while his subordinate, General Charles Cornwallis, had pursued the retreating Americans across New Jersey with relentless efficiency. The rebellion that had begun with such promise at Lexington and Concord seemed destined to end in ignominious defeat. Washington's spies had brought intelligence that would either save the revolution or doom it entirely. Across the river in Trenton, approximately 1,500 Hessian mercenaries under Colonel Johann Rall were celebrating Christmas with characteristic German enthusiasm. The professional soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, had grown complacent in their winter quarters. They viewed the ragged Continental Army as little more than an annoyance farmers playing at war against the might of the British Empire. The audacious plan forming in Washington's mind would have seemed impossible to any conventional military strategist. Cross the ice-choked Delaware in the dead of winter, march 9 miles through a blizzard, and attack a fortified position held by some of Europe's finest soldiers. The odds were astronomical, the risks catastrophic. Failure would mean the complete destruction of the Continental Army and the end of American independence before it truly began. As Washington surveyed his frostbitten troops, he knew this moment would define not just his leadership, but the very soul of the nascent United States. The men before him represented more than just an army. They were the embodiment of an idea that free men could govern themselves, that tyranny could be overthrown by those brave enough to resist it. Yet ideas meant nothing if the men carrying them lacked the will to fight. The general's aide-de-camp, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, approached through the swirling snow at barely 19 years old. Hamilton possessed a sharp intellect that complemented Washington's strategic vision. "The boats are ready, sir," he reported, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners had prepared for the crossing. Washington nodded grimly. The Marblehead men, fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, were perhaps the only soldiers in his army capable of navigating the treacherous waters. Their expertise would be crucial in the hours to come, for if the crossing failed, there would be no second chance. The wind howled across the river, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the weight of history. In a few hours, Washington would either salvage the American cause from the brink of extinction or watch it die in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The Battle of Trenton would be remembered as either a desperate last stand or the moment when everything changed. As the first boats pushed into the dark waters, none of the shivering soldiers could imagine that their actions would set in motion a chain of events, leading to another battle, Princeton, that would transform their dying rebellion into a war of liberation that would inspire oppressed peoples for generations to come. The crossing of the Delaware proved even more harrowing than Washington had anticipated. Ice chunks the size of millstones crashed against the boats as Colonel Glover's mariners fought to maintain their course through the storm-lashed waters. The nor'easter that had begun as gentle snowfall transformed into a blizzard of biblical proportions, with winds so fierce they threatened to capsize the heavily laden craft. Men gripped their muskets with frozen fingers, praying to whatever god would listen that they would live to see another dawn. By the time the last boat reached the New Jersey shore, Washington's carefully planned surprise attack was running 3 hours behind schedule. Dawn would break soon, and with it, any hope of catching the Hessians unprepared would vanish like morning mist. The general faced an agonizing decision: abort the mission and retreat across the Delaware, or press forward with an assault in broad daylight against alert defenders. Lesser commanders might have chosen the safety of withdrawal, but Washington understood that retreat would mean the death of the revolution. The march to Trenton tested every man's endurance to its breaking point. The storm had transformed familiar roads into treacherous paths of ice and slush. Soldiers left bloody footprints in the snow, their worn boots providing little protection against the frozen ground. 2 men collapsed from exposure and died along the route, their sacrifice a grim reminder of the stakes involved. Yet the army pressed on, driven by their commander's unwavering determination and the desperate hope that this gamble might change their fortunes. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive account Washington's Crossing, the psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. The Continental Army was literally fighting for its survival. Colonel Rahl, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the approaching danger. The Hessian commander had dismissed warnings from loyalist informants about potential American activity, confident that no army would attempt an attack in such weather. His soldiers, professional warriors who had served in the 7 Years' War, shared their commander's contempt for the colonial rebels. They had spent Christmas evening drinking and playing cards, secure in their belief that winter campaigns were impossible in this barbarous land. At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, Washington's army struck Trenton with the fury of avenging angels. The surprise was complete and devastating. Captain Alexander Hamilton unlimbered his artillery at the head of King Street, while Captain William Washington led his cavalry in a thunderous charge through the town center. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, stumbled from their quarters in various states of undress, struggling to form defensive lines as American soldiers poured into the streets. From every direction, the battle lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would reverberate for centuries. 900 Hessian soldiers surrendered, while only 4 Americans were wounded. A military victory so lopsided it seemed divinely ordained. Colonel Rahl, mortally wounded while trying to rally his men, died knowing that his complacency had cost his king a valuable garrison and the Americans their first significant victory since the siege of Boston. The psychological transformation of the Continental Army was immediate and profound. Men who had shuffled across the Delaware as defeated refugees now stood as victorious soldiers. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered by farmers and shopkeepers who had dared to challenge the world's most powerful empire. Word of the victory spread through the colonies like wildfire, rekindling hope in hearts that had grown cold with despair. Yet Washington knew that one victory, however spectacular, would not win a war. British reinforcements were already marching toward Trenton, led by the formidable General Cornwallis himself. The American commander faced another crucial decision: retreat with his prizes intact, or remain in New Jersey and risk everything on another throw of the dice. The choice he made would lead to Princeton, where the fate of American independence would hang in the balance once more. General Charles Cornwallis received news of the Trenton disaster while attending a dinner party in New York. The crystal glasses at fine china, a stark contrast to the brutal reality unfolding in New Jersey. The Earl, one of Britain's most competent military commanders, had earned his reputation through methodical campaigns in Europe and India. His aristocratic bearing masked a sharp tactical mind that had repeatedly outmaneuvered American forces. During the autumn retreat, now, for the first time since the rebellion began, he faced an opponent who had struck back with devastating effectiveness. Cornwallis immediately canceled his planned leave to London and began assembling a formidable force to crush Washington's impudence. 8,000 British and Hessian troops converged on Princeton, transforming the quiet college town into a military staging ground. The general's strategy was simple and brutal: trap the Americans against the Delaware River and destroy them utterly. This time, there would be no escape across frozen waters. Washington's luck had finally run out. The British advance began on January 1st, 1777, with Cornwallis personally leading the main column toward Trenton. His confidence was justified by overwhelming numerical superiority and the quality of his troops. These were not surprised garrison soldiers, but veteran regiments who had conquered half the known world in service to the crown, the rebels. Christmas surprise had been impressive, but now they would face the full might of professional European warfare. Washington, meanwhile, found himself in an impossible position. His victory at Trenton had been a morale boost of incalculable value, but it had also painted a target on his army that every British commander in North America was eager to strike. The Delaware crossing had been a desperate gamble born of necessity now. He faced an enemy who was alert, angry, and advancing with overwhelming force. Retreat seemed the only rational option. Yet Washington understood that withdrawal would squander all the psychological gains from Trenton. The American commander's response revealed the strategic genius that would make him one of history's great military leaders. Instead of retreating or accepting battle on Cornwallis's terms, Washington chose a third option that would confound his enemies and transform the war's trajectory. He would give Cornwallis what he wanted, a confrontation at Trenton while secretly preparing an entirely different kind of blow on January 2nd. The British and American armies faced each other across Sunpink Creek, south of Trenton. Cornwallis probed the American defenses throughout the afternoon, testing Washington's resolve and searching for weaknesses. The Continental soldiers, their confidence bolstered by recent victory, repulsed each attack with determined resistance. As evening approached, the British general felt satisfied that he had successfully trapped his quarry. Tomorrow would bring the decisive battle that would end this troublesome rebellion. "We'll bag the old fox in the morning," Cornwallis reportedly declared to his subordinates, certain that Washington had nowhere to run. The Earl's confidence seemed entirely justified. The Americans were outnumbered more than 2-1, trapped with their backs to the river, facing an enemy that had never lost a major engagement in this war. Military logic suggested that dawn would bring either Washington's surrender or his annihilation. But Washington was no ordinary opponent, and he had no intention of fighting the battle his enemy expected. As Cornwallis settled into his comfortable quarters, planning the assault that would crown his career with glory, the American commander was already implementing one of the war's most audacious deceptions. Throughout the night, Continental soldiers would maintain their campfires and continue digging entrenchments, creating the illusion that they were preparing for a desperate last stand. In reality, Washington was orchestrating a strategic masterpiece that would leave his enemies grasping at shadows while he struck where they least expected it. The stage was set for Princeton, though neither Cornwallis nor his unsuspecting garrison in that quiet college town could imagine the storm that was about to engulf them. Washington's greatest victory was still 12 hours away, but the wheels were already in motion for a battle that would change everything. At midnight on January 2nd, 1777, the most audacious military maneuver of the Revolutionary War began in absolute silence, while Cornwallis's sentries watched the flickering campfires of what they believed was Washington's trapped army. The actual Continental force was slipping away into the frozen darkness like ghosts escaping their own funeral. The deception was masterful in its simplicity. A skeleton crew of 400 men remained behind to maintain the illusion, keeping fires burning and occasionally making noise to suggest normal camp activity, while the main army vanished into the New Jersey night. Washington had chosen a route that would have challenged his men even in favorable conditions. The back roads to Princeton were little more than cart paths, winding through dense forests and across frozen streams that could easily break a horse's leg or snap a cannon axle. In the bitter January cold, with men still exhausted from the Trenton victory and the previous night's engagement, the march represented a supreme test of endurance and discipline. Yet the Continental soldiers pressed forward with remarkable determination, understanding instinctively that their commander was leading them towards something momentous. General Hugh Mercer, the Scottish-born physician-turned-warrior, commanded the advance guard as they navigated through the barrens toward their objective. Mercer had fought alongside Washington during the French and Indian War, and his experience in wilderness warfare proved invaluable as they avoided British patrols and navigated treacherous terrain. Behind him marched men who represented every corner of American society: New England farmers, Pennsylvania craftsmen, Virginia gentlemen, and recent immigrants seeking a new life in a new world. They were united by something more powerful than military discipline. They were fighting for the radical idea that common men could govern themselves without kings or nobles. The psychological state of these soldiers deserves particular attention. As documented in John Ferling's Almost a Miracle, The American Victory in the War of Independence, these were men who had endured months of retreat and defeat, who had seen their cause reduced to its most desperate straits, yet who now marched through the darkness with renewed purpose and confidence. As dawn approached on January 3rd, the Continental Army reached the outskirts of Princeton, a sleepy college town that housed Nassau Hall, the largest stone building in colonial America. The town served as winter quarters for British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, who commanded approximately 1,200 troops composed of the 17th, 40th, and 55th Regiments of Foot. These were seasoned soldiers who had served with distinction in previous campaigns, but they were also men who had grown comfortable in their winter billets, never imagining that rebel forces would dare approach within striking distance. Of such a large British concentration, Washington divided his forces for a coordinated assault, demonstrating the tactical sophistication that would characterize his later victories. General John Sullivan would lead the main body along the post road to attack the town directly, while Mercer's brigade would swing wide to cut off escape routes and prevent British reinforcements from reaching the battle. Meanwhile, Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery would provide artillery support, and the Continental Cavalry would exploit any breakthrough that developed during the fighting. The plan was elegant in its conception, but fraught with danger in execution. Unlike Trenton, where surprise had been absolute, the Princeton garrison might have received warning of their approach. British sentries were alert, and any number of factors could transform a calculated risk into a catastrophic defeat. Washington was essentially betting his entire army on a single engagement, with no possibility of retreat if things went wrong. The Delaware River was too far behind them, and Cornwallis's main force would soon discover their deception and begin pursuit. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the frost-covered fields around Princeton, Washington's soldiers could see Nassau Hall rising above the town like a monument to learning and civilization. Within hours, this peaceful academic setting would become a battlefield that would determine whether American independence survived its second winter or perished in the morning mist. The approaching battle would test not only the Continental Army's newfound confidence, but also Washington's ability to transform a desperate strategic situation into decisive victory. The fate of a nation rested on what happened next, though the sleeping British garrison had no idea that history was about to knock on their door with musket fire and cannon thunder. The battle erupted at sunrise on January 3rd when Captain Joseph Moulder's Pennsylvania militia encountered Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood's column along the post road, just as the British were marching out of Princeton toward Trenton. The collision was entirely unexpected by both sides. Mawhood believed he was joining Cornwallis's pursuit of Washington's trapped army, while the Americans assumed they would catch the British garrison still in their winter quarters. Instead, two forces moving with completely different objectives crashed into each other with the fury of opposing storms. General Hugh Mercer's advance guard bore the brunt of the initial engagement as they moved to cut the post road and prevent British escape. The veteran Continental troops, many of whom had fought at Trenton just a week earlier, advanced with confidence across the frozen fields toward William Clark's farm. But confidence alone could not overcome professional military training and superior positioning. Mawhood's regulars, though surprised by the encounter, quickly formed disciplined firing lines and unleashed devastating volleys that sent the Americans reeling backward in confusion. The British 17th Regiment of Foot lived up to its fearsome reputation as Mawhood personally led a bayonet charge that shattered Mercer's brigade like glass. The Scottish general, attempting to rally his men around a stand of trees, found himself surrounded by British soldiers who mistook him for Washington due to his similar height and bearing. Refusing to surrender, Mercer fought with his sword until bayonet thrusts brought him down, mortally wounded. His fall seemed to symbolize the collapse of American hopes within minutes. The careful battle plan had dissolved into chaos. As Continental soldiers fled in panic across the fields, Washington witnessed the disaster unfolding from his position with the main army and faced the most critical decision of his military career. The logical response would be to cut losses and retreat before the situation deteriorated further. His army was scattered, his advance guard was broken, and British reinforcements were surely approaching from Trenton. Every military manual ever written would have counseled immediate withdrawal to preserve what remained of the Continental force. Instead, Washington spurred his horse directly toward the sound of gunfire, riding into the chaos with a courage that bordered on madness. The sight of their commander charging through British musket fire rallied the fleeing soldiers, as nothing else could have done. Men who moments before had been running for their lives suddenly turned to follow their general back into battle. Their panic transformed into desperate determination. By Washington's personal example of leadership under fire, the moment when Washington rode between the opposing lines, so close to British muskets that his aide closed his eyes expecting to see his commander shot down, represented more than just tactical bravery. It embodied the transformation of American military psychology. From defensive survival to offensive aggression, Captain Hamilton's artillery, meanwhile, had found positions that allowed devastating enfilade fire along the British lines. The young officer, who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury, demonstrated tactical genius as he shifted his guns to support the renewed American assault. His cannon fire, combined with coordinated infantry attacks from multiple directions, finally broke the British formation that had seemed invincible just minutes earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his isolated force could not withstand a sustained assault by superior numbers, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Trenton. His disciplined retreat prevented the complete destruction of his command, but it also surrendered the field to Washington's army. The psychological impact was enormous. For the second time in a week, Continental soldiers had defeated professional European troops in open battle. The fighting around Princeton lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would echo through history. Nassau Hall, which had served as British headquarters, surrendered after a brief artillery bombardment that became legendary when one cannonball allegedly decapitated a portrait of King George II hanging in the building. The symbolism was perfect: American gunpowder destroying the image of royal authority in a temple of learning and enlightenment. As British survivors retreated toward New Brunswick and American soldiers celebrated their victory around Nassau Hall, Washington understood that something fundamental had changed in the character of the war. The Battle of Princeton had been more than just another tactical success. It had demonstrated that the Continental Army could not only survive, but prevail against the world's most powerful military force. The immediate aftermath of Princeton revealed the battle's true strategic significance as news of the victory spread through the colonies like wildfire. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had fled to Baltimore in terror just weeks earlier, began making plans to return to their capital. Throughout New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, militia units that had disbanded after harvest season suddenly reformed, their ranks swelled by men inspired by Washington's string of victories. The revolution that had seemed all but dead in December was experiencing a resurrection that would fundamentally alter the war's trajectory. British General William Howe, commanding from his comfortable New York headquarters, found himself facing a strategic nightmare that Princeton had crystallized. His scattered garrisons throughout New Jersey were now vulnerable to American attack, their isolation magnified by the psychological impact of two stunning defeats. The myth of British invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of imperial conquest, lay in ruins alongside Hessian equipment abandoned in Trenton streets, and British colors captured at Nassau Hall. Howe ordered an immediate withdrawal of most British forces to defensive positions around New York and New Brunswick, effectively surrendering control of central New Jersey to Washington's revitalized army. The international implications proved equally dramatic as European powers reassessed American prospects for independence. French King Louis XVI, who had been secretly providing limited aid to the rebels, now authorized his foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, to begin serious negotiations for a formal alliance. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had transformed what appeared to be a dying rebellion into a potentially viable war of independence that might serve French interests against their British rivals. Spanish and Dutch diplomats also began reconsidering their positions, recognizing that American success could reshape the global balance of power. Washington's strategic genius became fully apparent in the weeks following Princeton as he established winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. The position was militarily brilliant, close enough to threaten British outposts, but protected by mountainous terrain that made enemy assault nearly impossible. More importantly, the location allowed his army to control the roads between New York and Philadelphia, effectively placing the Continental Army astride British lines of communication. From this base, American forces could threaten British foraging expeditions, intercept supply convoys, and demonstrate that they remained a formidable presence in the heart of the rebellion. The transformation within the Continental Army itself was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Princeton. Soldiers who had endured the retreats of autumn 1776 now possessed unshakable confidence in their ability to defeat professional European forces. The mythology surrounding Washington's leadership reached legendary proportions, with stories of his courage under fire spreading throughout the ranks and beyond. Men who had been ready to abandon the cause in December were now enlisting for extended service, their faith in ultimate victory restored by 2 weeks that changed everything. As documented in Thomas Fleming's The Winter Soldiers, the psychological transformation of American military culture can be traced directly to this period, when citizen soldiers proved they could match or exceed the performance of professional armies. European military observers struggled to comprehend what had occurred in New Jersey. During those crucial 2 weeks, the accepted wisdom of 18th century warfare held that amateur forces could not defeat trained regulars in open battle, yet Washington's army had done exactly that twice in rapid succession. The implications extended far beyond American independence. If colonial farmers could humble the British Empire, what did that mean for established social and political orders throughout Europe? The Battle of Princeton had accomplished something that no previous American victory had achieved. It demonstrated that the Continental Army was not merely capable of defensive warfare or guerrilla raids, but could execute complex offensive operations against fortified positions held by veteran troops. This strategic capability would prove crucial in later campaigns from Saratoga to Yorktown, as Washington's forces evolved from desperate survivors into the military instrument that would ultimately secure American independence. By establishing the psychological foundation for sustained resistance, Princeton ensured that the Revolutionary War would continue long enough for international alliances to develop, British resolve to weaken, and American military institutions to mature. The battle's true significance lay not in its immediate tactical results, but in its transformation of a dying rebellion into a viable war of liberation that would inspire oppressed peoples for generations to come. The reverberations of Princeton extended far beyond the frozen fields of New Jersey, creating ripple effects that would reshape not only the Revolutionary War, but the entire concept of democratic revolution worldwide. Within days of the victory, British military planners in London found themselves confronting a strategic reality they had refused to acknowledge. The American rebellion possessed both the military capability and popular support necessary for sustained resistance. The comfortable assumption that a few sharp defeats would bring the colonists to heel had been shattered as completely as the Hessian formations at Trenton. King George III, upon receiving detailed reports of the Princeton disaster, reportedly declared that he would rather lose his American colonies entirely than grant them the independence they demanded. This royal obstinacy, which might have seemed like strength in December 1776, now appeared as dangerous rigidity. In the face of military reality, Parliament began to fracture along factional lines, with weak politicians questioning the wisdom of continuing an increasingly costly war against an enemy that had demonstrated unexpected resilience and tactical sophistication. The French court at Versailles moved from covert assistance to open alliance with remarkable speed. Following Princeton, the Marquis de Lafayette, barely 19 years old, volunteered for service with Washington's army, bringing with him not only his own military talents, but also symbolic representation of European aristocratic support for American independence. French gold, weapons, and naval power would prove decisive in the war's ultimate outcome. But it was Princeton that convinced Louis XVI that supporting the Americans represented a worthwhile investment rather than a charitable gesture toward a doomed cause. Washington's tactical innovations at Princeton influenced military thinking throughout the Atlantic world. His use of coordinated night marches, deceptive positioning, and concentrated artillery fire became standard techniques studied in European military academies. The battle demonstrated that 18th century warfare's rigid conventions could be successfully challenged by commanders willing to adapt their methods to local conditions and exploit enemy assumptions. This tactical flexibility would become a hallmark of American military doctrine for generations to come. The psychological transformation of American society proved equally profound and lasting. Princeton had shown that common citizens fighting for principles they believed in could defeat professional armies serving monarchical powers. This revelation energized democratic movements throughout Europe and Latin America, providing a template for successful resistance against established authority. The French Revolution, the Latin American Wars of Independence, and numerous other democratic uprisings would draw inspiration from the examples set by Washington's citizen soldiers. Within the Continental Army, Princeton established leadership patterns and institutional traditions that would survive long after the Revolutionary War ended. The officer corps that emerged from the Battle of Hamilton, Lafayette, Ehrenberg, and others would dominate American politics for the next generation. Their shared experience of following Washington through the darkest hours of the Revolution created bonds of loyalty and mutual respect that helped stabilize the new republic. During its early years, Nassau Hall, the site of the battle's climax, became a powerful symbol of American academic and intellectual freedom. The College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, would produce numerous presidents, Supreme Court justices, and other national leaders who traced their inspiration to the moment when cannon fire shattered royal portraits in their halls. The building itself was carefully preserved as a monument to the principle that learning and liberty were inseparable. The strategic lessons of Princeton echoed through American military history, from the Civil War to World War II and beyond. The concept of maintaining offensive capability even during apparent defeat, the importance of inspiring leadership in crisis situations, and the value of psychological warfare in demoralizing superior enemies all became enduring elements of American military doctrine. Every subsequent generation of American commanders would study Washington's New Jersey campaign as a masterpiece of leadership under pressure. Perhaps most significantly, Princeton established the precedent that American democracy was worth fighting for, even against overwhelming odds. The battle occurred at the precise moment when the revolutionary cause seemed most hopeless. Yet Washington's victory proved that determined citizens could overcome any challenge when fighting for their fundamental rights. This lesson would sustain the American people through Civil War, world wars, and countless other trials that tested their commitment to democratic principles. The Battle of Princeton changed the course of the Revolutionary War forever by transforming a desperate struggle for survival into a confident march toward victory. More than that, it demonstrated to the world that the ideals of human freedom and self-government were not merely philosophical abstractions, but practical realities worth any sacrifice to achieve. In those few hours on a January morning in 1777, the future of democratic civilization hung in the balance and emerged triumphant, forever changing the trajectory of human history.